Alrighty, then y'all should be able to see the lecture on the screen. We talked about the major psychological studies that were done on social psychology, like study on conformity with the Ash line test, the study on obedience with the Stanley Milgram shock experiment, and then the study on authority roles and stereotype threat with the Stanford Prison Project with Philip Zimbardo. Okay, so all of this shows that even though we're individuals and we like to think that we wouldn't do certain things or what have you, that peer pressure and normative social influence does have an effect on our behavior. So social situations can dictate and control our behavior. Okay, so now we're going to move on to another section of the lecture with social influences on the self, so the individual. You have your self-concept, which is the question of who am I? What is my identity? What are core parts of my identity? And what are temporary parts of my identity? Okay, that revolves around self-esteem as well. Okay, so your self-worth. What are you worth and why are you worth that? Okay, so self-esteem falling into that. Now, most of our identity is going to be based on the groups that we associate ourselves with. These are known as reference groups. These are the people that we use to compare ourselves to note if we're fulfilling our possible selves or our ideal selves. And typically we're going to align ourselves with a reference group that we have a lot in common with or that we identify with, okay? Within that, we have schema and self-schema that filter how we perceive the world around us. And everyone in schema and self-schema is going to be different. And that can lead to some miscommunication at times. So schema is a cognitive filter. We all see the world through schemas. It's not that we're doing it consciously or purposely. It's just that they simply exist and that's how we view the world. Kind of how like you're not always aware when you're wearing contacts or when your glasses are on your face. It's just you're seeing things and it's happening. So in schema, this is a cognitive filter through which we interpret the world and the environment. Okay, so this is based on our experiences for what should be or what should not be. Within that, we have the self schema, which is a construct about yourself, an identity about yourself. So say, for instance, my self schema is going to be focused on the schools that I went to, or what gender I am, or what experiences I have, what interests do I have, like reading or cats. Okay, all of that fulfills how I view myself. That is my self schema. I would like to see myself as fairly intelligent. I would like to see myself as fairly kind. Okay, so how do you perceive yourself? Now, Hazel Marcus, in her studies on the schema that we have about ourselves, she noted that these concepts or these constructs about the self can be relatively stable or malleable, meaning permanent or changeable. The more core, okay, or central a self schema is, the more stable it will be. So the more permanent. I have a pretty stable concept about myself as a woman. Okay, that's not likely to change. Y'all may have a malleable construct of yourself as a high school student. That will change over time. It's guaranteed to change over time. So that's what it means by stable versus malleable. Okay, so this can relate to gender identification, ethnicity, race, any in-group or reference group that you could be a part of. Does anyone have any questions on this slide? All right. With this self schema, this is how we filter through our perceptions of ourselves or others. So like if you have a self schema of yourself as being outgoing and extroverted, then how would you perceive a party? As fun, okay, as something to go to that you're going to enjoy. But what if you're introverted and reserved? Then how might you see a party or a large get together? As stressful, not worth it, or as a way to potentially embarrass yourself or make a spectacle of yourself. Okay, so all of these self schema help us interpret and how we feel about events that we go through. Okay, we also have self schema when it comes to our possible selves. Okay, aspects that we aspire to be or we could conceivably be. Okay, so like possible selves. You may have a possible self of you as an engineer, or you may have a possible self as you as a father or a mother or an aunt or an uncle or just a parent in general. Okay, so those are your possible selves that could happen maybe 5, 10, 20, 30 years in the future. That can define your self schema as well. Now, as we develop these schema about ourselves, we also create schema about others, and that's how we interpret other people's behavior. So I have a very central self schema as a woman. So if I'm walking down the street at night, okay, and I see some random guy walking behind me, I might interpret that. I might have that cognitive filter of, this is a potential threat. I should cross the street, or I should make sure my earbuds aren't in so I can be, aware to respond at any time. Whereas the guy's self schema, he doesn't see himself as a bad guy. He knows that he's not a threat. And so he might see me as overreactive or just weird, the fact that I would cross the street potentially because of him. Okay, so how we see other people and how we see ourselves is filtered through this script of ourselves. So when it comes to bias, we're typically going to be have a positive bias towards our in-group and a negative bias towards an out-group. And these are pretty self-explanatory. They're literally like in the name. So an in-group is a group that you relate to. You have a common feature with. You have strong loyalty and respect and togetherness. Okay, so families are in groups. Your senior class could be an in-group. Your high school could be an in-group. Okay, some of y'all I see, I'm not in like, nope. You're like, yeah, my sister, I don't know her. Versus your out group, okay, would be anyone that you are in competition with or you're not necessarily aligned with. It doesn't necessarily have to be full-blown animosity. It could just be competition, okay, like a rival school. If we're playing a school in basketball, like BTW, do we want BTW to win? No, we want LAMP to win because that's our in group. We're a part of LAMP High School, so we're inherently going to have a bias against the competitor team that we go up against. Does that make sense so far? All right. The Pygmalion effect is also called the teacher expectancy effect. Teacher expectancy is pretty on the nose, but it's also known as Pygmalion effect, so that's why we mention it. This was a study by Rosenthal, who is one of your vocabulary terms, I think, from Unit 8, who studied the effect of expectations, specifically on students. So how this worked was they get a bunch of teachers and a bunch of kids. They give the kids a test, but it doesn't mean anything. The scores don't mean anything. They don't collect the scores. Well, they tell the teachers, hey, here are 20 kids that aced the test. They're going to be your star pupils. Now, did those 20 students actually ace the test? No, they were given fake results. So these are random students that they've picked saying, hey, these are the quote unquote good ones. These are the ones that are going to excel. Then at the end of the year, after the students had been in the classroom with the teacher for an entire academic year, they give an actual test to see how much the kids know. And they found that the initial 20 students that they had labeled as above average ended up being above average. Okay, now statistically, how likely is it that that happened, that they just happened to randomly pick the top 20 highest scoring students before they gave the test? It's not very likely. So it has less to do with, the fact that the students were just inherently above average, and more to do with how the teachers treated the students that were supposedly above average. So the teachers must have unconsciously influenced the students to do better. They unknowingly behaved in a manner due to a preconceived notion about that student. Now, this is the best case scenario of, you hear that this student is really good, and so they end up being really good. The opposite side of that would be, you hear that this student is an underachiever, or that they struggle with math or English or whatever subject it is that you teach. Then you could unconsciously have a bias or an expectation against that child that causes that belief to manifest. Okay, so that's why it's important for teachers not to focus on like, oh, what other teachers have said about particular students. Okay, just let them come in as a fresh slate, okay, a fresh tabula rasa, and see what they can do in your class rather than looking back at what they've done in previous classes. Does that make sense so far? Okay, so if I were told by a teacher that you were extremely smart, I might unconsciously treat you differently throughout the year, like listening more closely to you or paying more attention to you. Now, note how this is unconscious. Are these teachers purposely trying to teach their students or treat their students differently? No, it is an unconscious bias, but the effect is still there. Okay, you have to be able to separate between intentions and effects. You may have good intentions, but you could still have negative effects. Something that relates to this Pygmalion effect is the self-fulfilling prophecy, which is pretty on the nose. It makes sense once you just sound it out. The self-fulfilling prophecy is the idea that believing something will make it occur. So as we see in these steps, first we make a prediction based on a belief. I've heard that Andy is a poor student in history. So I have a belief about Andy. He is not good at history. I act towards Andy as if that belief is true. So when Andy comes in my class, I'm just like, hey, you know, if you need any extra tutoring, or here's the notes, I already hand typed them for you. Okay, then I'm acting as if he's inherently not good at history. Because I act as if he's not good at history, that becomes true. He starts doing poorly on his tests, or he writes an essay and I score it very low, okay, because the expectation is, oh, he's not good at this class. So we observe this effect, the fact that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and that reinforces the initial belief. Andy is bad at history. Okay, so that's why it's important to always have high expectations for your students or your children, because they're more likely to reach for those expectations rather than if you hold them at a middle average level or at a below average level. You don't want a self-fulfilling prophecy to come true when it comes to negative beliefs about an individual. We good so far? Now, when it comes to comparing ourselves to others, we do this a lot. There are two types of comparison that we do. We have upward social comparison and downward social comparison. With upward social comparison, we compare ourselves to people who appear to have it better. So you're scrolling through your social media, you're scrolling through the TikTok or the Instagram, and you see somebody who has lost a lot of weight or can bench press a car, or has like the best dance moves or the clearest skin or the best filters, right? They're at the beach, they're showing off their car. That's upward social comparison. You look at people who have it better than you, and that makes you feel like crap. Okay, so this is not healthy. That's kind of a big issue with social media, is that everyone tries to put on the best version of themselves on the internet. And that makes us feel inadequate compared to other people, because people don't always go on Instagram and post their ugly photos, right? Because those don't get likes. Now compare that with downward social comparison. With downward social comparison, you look at people who have it less fortunate than you do. I know that says mobility. It's supposed to say comparison. I'm sorry, I wrote it wrong. So let's say that we're in the middle of a pandemic and I think, oh, I still have a job. I have a house. Both my cats are healthy. I'm healthy. Okay, then I see somebody who's on the corner on the street with a shopping cart asking for money. Okay, by that downward social comparison, I appear to be doing much better than the person that I'm comparing myself to. And so this makes me feel better than if I had done upward social comparison. Okay, so it's important to keep that in mind. Whatever context you're in and how you interpret it can affect your mood. Now, does this mean that we should go and try to find people who are less fortunate than us and be like, hey, I'm going to compare myself? Like, no. Okay, but you unconsciously do this. And so it's important to note why that is, or how that has an effect on your mood and your self-schema. Are we good so far? All right, so now we're going to move on to attribution. We're going to talk about the theories and the errors with attribution. Now, first, before we get started, we need to talk about the two dimensions of attribution. And y'all know that to attribute something means to associate it with something. You have internal versus external attribution, and you have stable versus unstable attribution. An internal attribution means that it is specific to that individual. It is inherent. It is dispositional. An external attribution means that it's the environment. It's outside of that person's control. Okay, so like if I said, or no, so let's say that my cat got sick. Okay, and no, that doesn't make sense. I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of an example for this. Let's say that I train a puppy and the puppy picks up on those tricks very quick. Like they learn, oh, to sit and to bark and to stay. Well, if I say that the puppy's very smart, that's an internal attribution. Okay, that belongs to the puppy. It is something within the puppy inherently. It has nothing to do with me. If I said, oh, I'm really good at training dogs, okay, then that would be an external attribution as to why the dog is performing so well. It's because the dog had a good teacher. That's external, as opposed to the dog is smart. Unstable versus stable means that this is a permanent attribution or a temporary attribution. So let's say that it's stable. If the dog's really smart, then they're probably going to be smart the entire time. Okay, they're not just going to be smart one day and dumb the next. That's something that's stable, it is continuous. Versus unstable. Maybe the dog just was full that day. And so they were like, okay, I can focus on the tricks. Or maybe they were hungry and they're like, oh, I get treats. So as long as I do what I'm supposed to do, I get something for this. That would be unstable. They're not always going to be hungry or full every time that they're being trained. Okay, so I want y'all to draw this chart on your notes because it is going to be important for keeping these attributes separate. Just like when we did positive versus negative reinforcement and punishment, we're going to go through examples for each of these to help y'all get this locked down. So the situation that we're using for this example is a student making an A on a test. If we were to make this an internal and stable attribution, internal means it has to do something with the student. It is dispositional. It is inherent for the student. Stable means that it's fairly permanent. So what is something about the student that's permanent that would result in them making an A on a test? They're smart. That's internal. Okay, the student is smart. That's stable. It is a permanent attribution for that person. An amazing cheater. Okay, that I guess that works technically. It is internal and it is stable. So yeah, being a cheater or being really smart. What about if it's an external stable example? If it's external, that means it's not about the student, it's about the environment. So what about the test that's permanent made it possible for the student to make an A? It's an easy test. Okay, maybe it was all multiple choice, or maybe it was all matching, or maybe there was only one question on it and it just said, do you want an A, yes or no? And everyone put A. Okay, so that's an external stable. Some of y'all are like, please. That's an external stable attribution. The test is easy, has nothing to do with the student. And the test isn't going to magically get harder. It's going to stay easy. And now we're looking at internal and unstable. Unstable means that it's not permanent, but it is relating to the student. So what could the student do that's not a permanent feature of their personality that would result in them making an A? They guessed or they studied hard. For this one test, they studied super hard and over-prepared because maybe it was the difference between exemption or not exemption on a final. Okay, so that is an internal and unstable attribution. The student studied hard. It's still a focus on the student, but it's not something that's permanent. Maybe they only studied hard for that test, and every other test, they're just like, whatever, D's get degrees. Then with the external and unstable. Okay, external means it has nothing to do with the student. It has to do with the environment. And unstable means not permanent. Okay, so in addition to there being a test in the environment, there's also a teacher. Let's say that the test or an assignment was given out by the teacher and she just graded it on completion. Okay, that was her decision. Does that mean that she's always going to grade every assessment on completion? No, she's going to have to grade some of them for accuracy, hopefully, right? And so that would be an external, unstable attribute. The teacher in the environment made the assignment a completion grade. So if you did it, you made an A. Or the teacher was in a good mood. They may not always be in a good mood. So it's not stable, it is unstable. Happen to be sitting at a desk that has the answers written on it. Yeah, that would be external and unstable as well. Okay, so make sure that y'all have this chart in your notes to help you as we move through this unit. Yes, baby.
Can you go for one more time the internal stable and external stable?
Internal stable means that it's dispositional. It's something inherent about the student, and stable means permanent. So the student is smart. Okay, that's an inherent personality trait. External stable would mean that it's something outside of the individual. So the test was easy. That's going to be permanent because it's stable. Versus internal and unstable, that would be the student studied hard. Versus external and unstable, that would be the teacher was in a good mood, so made it a completion grade. We good so far? No worries. All right, so with attribution, this is how we try to explain behavior. Why do people do the things that they do? Who is responsible for that behavior? Is it something inherent within that person, or is it the environment acting upon them? So here's a popular political cartoon that's been making the rounds the past couple of years. It comes up on my Facebook every once in a while. To the left, it shows the parents yelling at the student saying, "These grades are terrible." Okay, who do they attribute the bad grades with? The student back in 1960. What about in 2010? Now, who do they attribute the bad grades to? The teacher. So instead of saying, oh, the student is responsible for the grades, not necessarily that they're smart or dumb, it could just be that they're just not doing the work. Now they've shifted that focus to the teacher for attribution. Does anyone need this slide? You do? Something bit me while I was outside. Something, not somebody. No, a student just rolled up on me. It was like chomp. So go to the office. That would be like the worst way to spread COVID. Zombie COVID. I would not live in a zombie apocalypse. I would just be like, no AC, no Wi-Fi, I'm out. I cannot stand to be even mildly inconvenienced. So attribution theories. With Fritz Heider, we have the idea of internal versus external attributions, which we've already discussed. Remember that internal is dispositional. It's the nature aspect. It's in their nature. The external factors is situational or nurture. It's the environment that results in these behaviors. Okay, this also covers stable attributions. Internal and stable within an individual would be something like smart versus dumb. Unstable attribution would be temporary and due to behavior, such as studying hard for a certain test or simply not studying because you wanted to watch TV instead. Now let me know when you're ready to move on from that slide. I'm trying to keep y'all on the same timeline as fifth period. Fifth period made it all the way to attitudes and society. Y'all have 1, 2, 3, 4. Y'all got 4 more slides to get caught up with them. They weren't writing anything down though. They were just like nothing on their desk, just like an empty desk, just staring at me like, do we understand? Like I even said, like, don't forget to write down this table. And they're just looking at me like, you're not my real dad.
I don't use my notes. I use the lectures.
You just rewatch them.
I like watch one time to speed. It's so much easier.
I must sound like a chipmunk. It's adorable.
I do that for all of the recorded lectures.
Mm.
Like I understand it. I'll watch it for an hour.
If it works, if you need something to put you to sleep at night, just play my lectures. It's like, this lecture slaps. Is that what the kids say? Like and subscribe. I'm gonna monetize my channel. Are we good on this slide? All right. So some errors in attribution. We're gonna look at the self-serving bias, which is exactly what it sounds like, the fundamental attribution error, and the actor-observer bias. So first we're gonna talk about Harold Kelly. He said that attribution can be tied to 3 factors: consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency. Okay, so if you have high consensus in a group, the attribution is external. If you have low consensus, then the attribution is internal. So let's use the example of me talking about a sports team. Let's say I'm talking about Lamp's baseball team. If I'm talking about the Lamp baseball team and I say they're really awesome, and then everyone around me agrees and says, yeah, they are really good. Okay, that means consensus is high in the group. So the attribution is external. It's not that the group is biased, it's that the team is good. So high consensus means external attribution. What they're saying about the team is true. Now, if there's low consensus, let's say I come into the group and I'm just like, Lamp baseball is the best baseball team that I've ever seen. And everyone kind of looks at me like, we haven't won a single game this year. Yeah, or something along those lines. Or like, Lamp football is the best team that's ever existed. It's like, we don't have one of those. I'm like, yeah, we're undefeated. Okay, that would mean that consensus is low, which means that the team probably isn't that good. I'm just biased. I'm just saying that they're good because it's an internal attribution. I want to say that they're good. Okay, so that's with consensus. Does the group agree or disagree? With distinctiveness, how often do I talk about sports? I don't. So that's distinct if I'm going on and raving about the Lamp baseball team. Okay, so if I never talk about sports, but then one day in class, I just go off talking about Lamp baseball, then that is a high rate of distinctiveness. That means that the attribution is external. The team must actually be good for her to rant and rave about a topic she doesn't really care about. Versus if all I talk about are sports, if all I talk about is baseball, even though I'm trying to teach psychology or history, then that's probably an internal attribution. Okay, that's not very distinct. So it's probably more so that I'm always talking about that topic. The team could be meh. Then we move on to consistency. If there's high consistency, then it's an internal attribution. If there's low consistency, then it's an external attribution. Okay, so high consistency means that I'm always exaggerating. Say that no matter what I talk about, I'm always going to talk about it positively. Okay, no matter what. You can't really trust what I'm saying then, because in terms of consistency, I'm always saying positive things about the sports teams. Okay, so I'm just exaggerating and I'm biased. That's internal. Versus if I rarely rave about things. Let's say that I'm just never excited about anything. And then all of a sudden, Lamp baseball. And I'm glowing and I'm talking and I start a TikTok page or a #1 fan page or something for Lamp baseball. That would be low consistency. That means that it must be external. The team must just be that good for her to be so crazy about it. Does that make sense so far? Okay. Now, when it comes to how we view other people and ourselves, we do have some errors that we make with our schema. The first one being the self-serving bias. This is our tendency to view ourselves in a more positive light. If something bad happens to us, it's not our fault. It's just life is unfair. If something good happens to us, then it's karma and we deserve it. Okay, so everything good that happens is because we deserve it. Everything bad that happens is because of forces outside of our control and has no reflection on us as an individual. Okay, so like for instance, you get an A on your test, it's because you're smart. It's because you studied hard and you deserve that A. Versus you make an F on a test. Well, the teacher never taught that. Or let's see, they never uploaded their recordings or something along those lines. Okay, internal versus external. It's someone else's fault. Now, this is when we're talking about ourselves. When we're talking about others or observing others, we have a very different bias. When it comes to us, we always want to see ourselves in a positive light. When it comes to others, we see them in a more critical light, a more negative light. Does anyone need this slide? You do? Okay. Now, Lee Ross is going to call this bias, when we observe others, the fundamental attribution error. So when we observe others, we associate their behavior with their internal disposition. We ignore other explanations. Are we good now, Sam?
Almost.
So let's say that you're driving and you see somebody get in a car accident in front of you. Now, if you had been the one who had gotten in the car accident, your self-serving bias would say, oh, well, the road was wet and the sun was in my eyes. It's not my fault. It was the environment that led to me crash. I'm actually a very good driver, right? But with the fundamental attribution error, when we see someone else go through that, we think, oh, they must be at fault. That person is a terrible driver. So we underestimate the impact of the environment and overestimate the impact of the individual's inherent personality or abilities. Okay, so that's what Lee Ross is going to call the fundamental attribution error. Now, Thomas Pettigrew is going to apply that more broadly. The ultimate attribution error is when we apply the fundamental attribution error, but instead of applying it to an individual that we're observing, we apply it to an entire group. So let's say you saw the car accident and you see that it's a teenage girl and you're just like, ugh, women drivers, or ugh, teenagers. Okay, that would be you applying the ultimate attribution error. That one person got in a car wreck, and so that reinforces your beliefs that women can't drive, or that young people can't drive, or that teenagers are irresponsible, must have been texting on her phone, that sort of mentality. Okay, so that's where we get things like prejudice, discrimination, and racism, applying something to an entire group when it comes to internal disposition informing their behaviors. So we have fundamental attribution error and the ultimate attribution error. Does anyone need this slide? No worries. Then we got one more and we'll be done for the day. So if you put those two ideas together, the idea that we view ourselves positively and that we view others more negatively and more critically, then you have the actor-observer effect. Okay, the actor-observer effect is where we attribute behaviors to the environment when we're the actor, but we attribute behaviors to the individual when we're observing somebody. Okay, so the difference between internal and external attribution. So if we got into a car wreck, oh, I veered off the road because a bird flew at me. It's not my fault. That bird came out of nowhere. You're like, you're in a zoo. I'm like, sorry, took a wrong left turn. Okay, should have made the signs better. Versus that lady is a horrible driver. That's inherently part of her disposition. So if it's us, we're just like, no worries, it was environmental, not permanent, doesn't reflect poorly on us. But if somebody else, then it's like, yeah, no, they had that coming because they're just terrible. You can't change that. You can't fix it. So combining all of those errors together for the actor-observer effect, also known as the correspondent interference theory.